The day I realized a luxury housing developer had been stealing from me, I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't investigating anything. I wasn't even angry yet. I was standing near the back corner of my property, holding a bucket of fence staples, when I noticed something that absolutely should not have been there. A hole. Not a big one. Not the kind you notice from distance. Just a section of wire fencing that had been cut clean through and folded back like somebody had opened a little doorway. And on the other side of that opening, disappearing into the ground, was a black plastic pipe. The weird thing is, my first thought wasn't that somebody was stealing from me. My first thought was, who in the world would be dumb enough to run a pipe across my property without asking? Turns out, that wasn't even close to how bad it really was. My name is Ethan Mercer, and for almost 12 years I've lived on 8 acres outside a small mountain town in western Colorado. Nothing fancy, just a modest house, a workshop I built myself, a vegetable garden that got way bigger than I originally planned, and a spring-fed pond that had been sitting there long before I ever bought the place. That pond was the reason I purchased the property. Not the house, not the view, the water. Out here, water means everything. People who grow up in cities sometimes don't understand that. They turn a faucet and water appears. Out here, especially during dry summers, water becomes the difference between thriving and struggling. My pond never ran dry. Ever. Even when neighboring properties were trucking water in during drought years, mine stayed stable because a natural spring fed it continuously. I built my garden around it. My irrigation system depended on it. Half the reason my little orchard survived every summer was because of that pond. It wasn't decoration. It was survival. For years, life was simple. Then the property next door sold. For as long as I'd lived there, that land had been untouched forest. Deer moved through it. Elk crossed it every fall. Nobody bothered anybody. Then survey flags appeared. Then bulldozers. Then excavation crews. Then giant signs advertising a luxury development called Cedar Summit Estates. Mountain living. Private roads. Exclusive community. The usual sales pitch. You know the kind. The advertisements promised buyers a chance to live among nature while simultaneously bulldozing half of it. At first, I didn't care. It wasn't my land. People can do whatever they want with property they legally own. That was my attitude. As long as they stayed on their side of the fence, we weren't going to have any problems. A few weeks after construction started, I met the project director. His name was Tyler Whitmore. Tyler looked exactly like the kind of guy who introduces himself by handing you a business card before you've even asked his name. Perfect haircut, perfect teeth, brand new work boots that had clearly never seen actual mud. The conversation started normally enough. Property boundaries, road access, utility easements. Then something shifted. He started asking questions about my pond. Specific questions. How deep was it? Did it ever dry up? How strong was the spring flow during summer? Had the water level changed over the years? At the time, I didn't think much about it. I figured engineers needed information. Maybe they were planning drainage systems. Maybe they were studying runoff. Who knows? I answered politely. He thanked me. Then he left. Looking back now, that conversation feels completely different. Sometimes your brain remembers details long before you understand why they matter. 3 months passed. Construction intensified. The noise became part of everyday life. Backup alarms, diesel engines, dump trucks grinding up and down the road before sunrise. Then one evening, while checking irrigation lines in the garden, I noticed something strange. The pond looked lower. Not dramatically lower, just enough to catch my attention. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was imagining things. A week later, it looked lower again. Then another week passed. Then another. By the end of the month, nearly a foot of water had disappeared. That's when the worry started creeping in. Because spring-fed ponds don't just lose water for no reason. Something had changed. And for the first time since buying that property, I found myself wondering if the thing I valued most out there was somehow slipping away right in front of me. I didn't know it yet, but that missing water was about to lead me straight into a fight that would eventually bring an entire multi-million-dollar development to its knees. The next couple of weeks turned into an obsession. Every evening after work, I'd walk the shoreline with a flashlight, studying the pond like it was some kind of crime scene. I checked the spillway. I checked drainage channels. I inspected the embankment, looking for erosion or signs of a leak. I even called my friend Nate, a retired irrigation contractor who knew more about water systems than anyone I'd ever met. Nate came out one Saturday morning carrying a thermos of coffee and that permanently skeptical expression he'd worn for as long as I'd known him. We spent almost 3 hours walking the property. Finally, he stopped near the edge of the pond, scratched his beard, and said something that made my stomach tighten. "Ethan, if this spring's flowing the way you've always described it, this water's going somewhere." Meaning it ain't disappearing. That sentence stayed with me. It ain't disappearing. Water had to be going somewhere. The question was where. 3 days later, I got my answer. I was following a game trail that ran uphill toward the property line when I noticed a patch of disturbed soil. Fresh dirt always looks different. Doesn't matter how well somebody tries to hide it. Nature has a texture to it, and freshly moved earth sticks out like a bad patch job on drywall. I walked closer. Then I saw the fence. The wire had been cut neatly between 2 posts and folded back. Not broken, not damaged. Cut deliberately. My pulse immediately started climbing. That's when I noticed the pipe. A thick black pipeline disappearing into the ground on my side of the property. For a second, my brain actually refused to process what I was looking at. I remember standing there thinking there had to be some explanation. Maybe it wasn't connected to my pond. Maybe it belonged to the county. Maybe there was some permit I didn't know about. Then I started following it. And with every step, those excuses became harder to believe. The pipe ran downhill toward the spring source feeding my pond. Then it turned, crossed beneath the fence, and continued directly into Cedar Summit Estates. I followed it all the way. What I found on the other side made me stop dead in my tracks. A massive water storage tank set near their concrete staging area. Workers moved around it casually. Hoses connected to pumps. Pumps connected to the pipeline. The pipeline connected to my property, to my water. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody looked like they were hiding anything. That was the part that honestly angered me the most. They weren't acting like thieves. They were acting like owners. Like somebody had simply decided my spring belonged to them now. I pulled out my phone and started recording everything. The damaged fence, the trench, the pipe, the pumps, the storage tank, every single inch. By the time I finished, I had nearly 40 minutes of footage. Then I made a phone call. Tyler answered on the second ring. "Hey, Ethan." The fact that he sounded cheerful almost made me laugh. I said, "I'm standing next to a water tank on your construction site." Silence. Just dead silence. Then he said, "Okay." I replied, "And I'm looking at a pipe running from that tank through a hole somebody cut in my fence." More silence. The kind that tells you everything. Finally, he cleared his throat. "We've had some temporary supply issues." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. Temporary supply issues? Look, Ethan, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. That sentence changed everything. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Like I was the problem. Like I was overreacting. Like cutting through my fence and taking water from my property was some minor misunderstanding. I said, "Turn it off. We need to discuss, turn it off. I'll have to speak with ownership." That was all I needed to hear. No apology. No denial. No surprise. Just calculations. I hung up. The drive into town took about 30 minutes. I spent most of it getting angrier with every mile. Not because of the water itself. Because of the attitude. Because somewhere inside that company a group of people had looked at my property and decided I didn't matter. They saw a resource. They saw an opportunity. They saw someone they assumed wouldn't fight back. By late afternoon, I was sitting across from a lawyer named Daniel Cross. Daniel wasn't flashy. No giant office. No expensive suit. Just a sharp mind and 20 years of experience dealing with property disputes throughout the county. He watched every second of my footage without interrupting. Then he watched parts of it again. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Do you have documentation for the spring?" "I think so." "You better find it." For the next several hours, we dug through records. Property surveys, historical filings, water permits, old county maps, documents so old some of them looked like they'd been stored in a barn. Around 7 that evening, Daniel stopped reading. His expression changed. "Well," he said quietly. "Well, what?" He slid a document across the desk. These people just made a very expensive mistake. It turned out the spring feeding my pond wasn't just part of my property. The water rights attached to it went back decades, long before Cedar Summit Estates existed, long before most of the surrounding development existed. The legal protections were far stronger than I ever realized. For the first time since finding that pipe, I felt something other than anger. I felt confident. The next morning, Daniel filed an emergency injunction. Things moved faster than I expected. A lot faster. Less than 24 hours later, county officials showed up at my property along with an environmental investigator and a hydrologist. Watching professionals work is fascinating. They don't care about your emotions. They care about evidence, measurements, data, facts. They traced the entire pipeline, measured flow rates, documented trenching, inspected connection points, photographed everything. One investigator spent nearly an hour studying the section of fence that had been cut. By mid-afternoon, they had enough information to estimate how much water had been diverted. When the hydrologist explained the number, even I was shocked. It wasn't hundreds of gallons. It wasn't a couple thousand. It was tens of thousands. And suddenly what had felt like a personal dispute started looking a whole lot more like something that could bring serious consequences down on everyone involved. I didn't know it yet, but the real damage wasn't going to come from me. It was going to come from the chain reaction that started the moment government vehicles rolled through the gates of Cedar Summit Estates. The following afternoon, I found myself standing beside 3 county vehicles as they rolled through the entrance of Cedar Summit Estates. It was one of those moments where everything suddenly feels very real. Up until then, it had mostly been phone calls, paperwork, meetings, and documentation. Now, government investigators were pulling onto an active construction site. Now, people were asking questions nobody wanted to answer. And judging by the expression on Tyler Whitmore's face when he spotted the county trucks, he knew exactly how serious things had become. The confidence I'd seen during our first meeting was gone. No polished smile, no corporate charm, no smooth explanations. Just a man trying very hard to calculate how much trouble he was in. The lead investigator walked directly to the storage tank. He reviewed photographs, checked measurements, compared notes with the hydrologist. Then he looked at Tyler. "You need to shut this system down immediately." Tyler started talking before the investigator even finished the sentence. "There seems to be some confusion. No. We believe there was access. No. We were operating under. No." The investigator didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Sometimes authority speaks loudest when it stays calm. A cease and desist order was handed over. The valve was shut off on the spot. And just like that, the water stopped flowing. What happened next was something I don't think the developers fully anticipated. Because the moment that water stopped flowing, the rest of the project started falling apart. Concrete crews couldn't stay on schedule. Foundation work slowed. Subcontractors began waiting on each other. Equipment rentals continued generating costs every single day. Deadlines slipped. Investors started calling. Buyers started asking uncomfortable questions. And every answer seemed to create 3 new problems. Meanwhile, Daniel and I kept moving forward. Trespassing, property damage, unauthorized resource diversion, environmental interference. The list kept growing. The county opened enforcement proceedings. State regulators became involved. Additional investigators started reviewing records. At first, Cedar Summit's executives tried the usual defenses. It was a misunderstanding. Then it became a communication error. Then it became a contractor mistake. Then, somehow, it became a paperwork issue. The story changed so many times I honestly lost track. The problem was that physical evidence doesn't care about explanations. Pipes don't install themselves. Trenches don't dig themselves. Storage systems don't magically appear overnight. Every piece of infrastructure represented a decision, and every decision left a trail. Months into the legal process, Discovery began uncovering documents, internal emails, budget discussion, schedule projections, meeting notes. The deeper investigators looked, the uglier things became. The project had been struggling long before they touched my property. Construction delays were already piling up. Costs were already exceeding projections. Investors were already demanding results. The pressure had been building for months. Somewhere along the way, somebody apparently decided that solving their water problem legally was too expensive, and stealing it seemed easier. That's the thing about shortcuts. People imagine shortcuts save time. Most of the time, they simply postpone consequences. Then one day, all those consequences arrive together. By early fall, local newspapers started covering the story. Neighbors talked about it at coffee shops. Contractors talked about it at supply yards. Potential buyers heard about it. And once public confidence starts disappearing, it's very difficult to get it back. Several home buyers canceled contracts. Then more canceled. Then lenders started asking questions. Then investors started asking even harder questions. Every problem fed another problem, like dominoes tipping over one after another. A few months after the investigation began, Cedar Summit's attorneys contacted Daniel with a settlement offer. On paper, it looked substantial. Daniel rejected it, not because he was trying to be difficult, because the investigations weren't finished. The full damages still hadn't been calculated. A second offer came later, then a third, each larger than the one before it. Each rejected for the same reason. The truth was simple. The situation had moved beyond a private disagreement. Too many agencies were involved. Too much evidence existed. Too many people had already seen what happened. Eventually, the case reached court. I remember sitting there listening to experts explain flow rates, water rights, property boundaries, environmental impacts, and diversion estimates. What struck me most was how boring justice sometimes looks from the outside. No dramatic speeches. No surprise witnesses. No movie scenes. Just facts. Documents. Evidence. One piece after another. Steady. Methodical. Unavoidable. When the ruling finally came down, it hit hard. Restitution. Property restoration. Environmental remediation. Legal costs. Monitoring requirements. Additional penalties. The financial impact was enormous. But by then, Cedar Summit Estates was already bleeding from a dozen other wounds. Investor confidence had collapsed. Buyer confidence had collapsed. Project schedules had collapsed. Relationships with contractors had collapsed. The legal judgment was less like the first punch and more like the final shove. About 4 months after county officials shut down the pipeline, the development company filed for bankruptcy protection. Just like that. A project worth millions of dollars. Years of planning, massive equipment, corporate executives, investors, marketing campaigns, all brought down by a decision that probably seemed harmless when somebody first suggested it. I drove past the site a few weeks later. The gates were closed. Construction equipment sat motionless. Half-finished structures stood silent against the mountains. The place looked frozen in time. And honestly, I didn't feel victorious. Not the way people imagine. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't cheering. I wasn't standing there thinking, good, they got what they deserved. What I felt was something quieter. Relief. Because when I got home that evening, I walked down to my pond. The water level had recovered. The spring was flowing normally again. The garden was healthy. The orchard was healthy. The thing I'd been fighting to protect was still there. And in that moment, I realized something important. The real win wasn't watching somebody lose. The real win was stopping the damage before it became permanent. Even now, years later, whenever I pass the section of fence that had been repaired, I think about how close I came to ignoring those early warning signs. One more month, maybe 2. Who knows how much water would have disappeared? Who knows how much damage would have been done? And I still think about Tyler sometimes. Because part of me wonders what would have happened if he'd simply knocked on my door that first day and told the truth. Maybe we still would have disagreed. Maybe the answer would have been no. But at least there would have been a conversation. Instead, they chose secrecy. They chose entitlement. They chose to act like other people's property only mattered when it was convenient. And that decision ended up costing them far more than any legal water source ever would have. So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered a major company secretly taking resources from your property, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have gone straight to lawyers and regulators? Or would you have tried to negotiate first? And where do you personally draw the line between a desperate business decision and outright theft? I'd really like to hear your perspective, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, And if you've ever experienced a situation where someone thought they were too powerful to be held accountable, share that story too. Sometimes the most interesting conversations happen after the story ends.